I'm going to be talking about salt marshes. The title of my talk is Kidneys of the Coast, and I'll discuss that, but I'll also talk about some more details and how they're important habitats and how they're important ecological systems as well as economic systems. I asked some of you earlier where you thought this might be. This is in Point Reyes. This is Tamales Bay, or Earthquake Bay, some people like to call it. And we're looking across here from the Pacific Plate, our active margin here, right, on the west coast. So we have very steep, shallow sort of shelf. I'm looking across on the North American Plate, and this is one of our larger salt marshes in this area of our coast, and that's Walker Creek. Okay, so what is a salt marsh? Well, one way that I like to think about it, and where I've done a lot of my research before, is looking at it as sort of that ecotone, or that transition zone. It's that transition zone between the land and the sea. And there's many ways you can define it, but Day et al. Is a well-known wetland ecologist who describes it as beds of intertidal rooted vegetation which are alternately inundated and drained by the tides. So this is a shot from the similar place I just showed you on that cover slide. And here we've got a salt marsh. This is a little bit more typical of our west coast salt marshes in that they are smaller than much of other places in the United States and the world because we are on that active margin. And what you see characterized here is that there's tidal inundation. It's a low tide right now, so the mudflats are exposed. Can't really picture it here, but you'll just take my word for it that you've got these draws that go in here and drain and bring in fresh water. And then you have sediment input. So you have that sediment there for the vegetation to be rooted in. And you have that freshwater flow as well. So that's why you find these. You don't find these on rocky areas because the vegetation couldn't be rooted. This is Hog Island for some of you who've been up to Tamales Bay. Okay, so I'm going to mainly focus on this area since we are West Coast, but I did want to put up marshes from other places around North America. They make up only about 1% of North America. So why the big to-do? Part of that's because they have very, very high ecological value, and through that they have very high economic value too. It's not always easy to pinpoint that number, but it's involved in many different areas. So what I've got here is a New England salt marsh, much greater, larger, taller vegetation. They often are quite extensive. They get scoured in the winter. That vegetation comes back, phragmites, straw hay came from these areas. And they make up around 14%. If we look at these numbers here, 14%, 26%, 58%, and about 1.5% on the West Coast, these are all areas that are on that passive margin on the East Coast, right? A lot more opportunity for sedimentation, not as much energy. So you don't have as much marsh development on the West Coast because of all that energy. Okay, then here's a picture of Southeast. You also have extensive marshes. They're all characterized by a large marsh plain, so you have much more opportunity for rooted vegetation that's going to get covered by those tides. This is a typical picture of the Gulf Coast. Maybe not as typical as it used to be, but somewhat typical. And a very extensive area. 58% of our marshes are from the Gulf Coast. Where's a major sediment source for the Gulf Coast? The Mississippi River, right? So you've got a great sediment source there. You've got tidal input, and you also have that freshwater input. And then these are both from the West Coast. I just chose these two different pictures to highlight more of a sort of northwest salt marsh with conifers right up to the edge of the ocean. And if you look at this versus something like this or this, you can see the vegetation is much more low-lying. It's not as extensive developed. And this is a more southern marsh, more typical of the type we have here around San Francisco Bay. This is from Carpinteria Salt Marsh down in Southern California. So you've got kind of a marsh plain, a very sort of limited high marsh area, but not nearly as extensive as the Southeast, New England, and Gulf Coast marshes. All right, so you're going to get the fact, I think, through this talk that marshes are important economically, not so much directly by those number values I gave you, but their role ecologically speaking, and how they provide a lot of ecosystem services as well. But Costanza is someone who, you could call him an ecological economist. Ecological Economy, the Journal of Ecological Economy, I think that's what it's called, is newer. It only came out in the last 15, maybe 20 years. It's a new concept. How can you put value on ecological measures? How can you put a money value on an ecosystem service? And so he's one of the people who really has worked towards doing this, including several other people in this et al. Reference here. But this is wetlands in general, goes as far as to say that these are the most important cover type globally, and they provide society with enormous ecosystem services. Just as an example of that, in South Carolina, wetlands are valued at $27.7 billion. That includes not just salt marshes, but there are more extensive salt marsh wetlands in that area. But that's because they support fisheries, a lot of very economically important fisheries. They also help with keeping the coastal waterways cleaner. They help with flood control. There's a lot that they provide. And so that's a valuation, for example, over 1 year of what the value of South Carolina salt marshes are. Another interesting fact here is that about 2/3 of the commercially valuable animals, I put animals because it's not just vertebrates, crab, right, really important. You probably heard a lot about Chesapeake Bay and what's going on there with restoring it to bring back the fisheries. Different type of bait. A lot of these rely on salt marshes throughout their life history, either their whole life history or part of it. And so 2/3 of commercially valuable animals use the marshes either directly or those adjacent waters that are fed by those nutrients from marshes. So high economic value. Okay, so here's just another picture to highlight what marshes look like. I'm going to go into the ecological part now. And this is a picture taken, this is Leemantur Beach. That's that big sand spit out at Leemantur Beach. And this is looking from, I'm standing here on sort of a coastal scrub community. Actually, it's more of a little bit of a grassland. And I'm looking across the high marsh. This area from here to here, this is the high marsh. It's actually part of the marsh. It gets inundated, not regularly, but on the really high tides. And then the marsh plain, which has a lot of pickleweed, and then the mud flats and the lower marsh. And it's one of the things that characterizes marshes that lends to their ecological importance is that there's really discrete sort of gradients across this system. Because you've got tides coming in and going out, because you have fresh water moving in and out, you get these very distinct zones. And those correspond to very distinct physical characteristics as well. So I'm not going to focus, you probably can't read this, but that's okay. But all of these graphs are showing mid-marsh on the left, this marsh plain here, ecotone, which is this high marsh area, and then upland, which is this grassland. It could be riparian. There's many different types of upland. And if we look here, for example, elevation, well, yeah, as you go from the marsh up, you increase in elevation. Along those lines, though, you also get a change in oxygen availability. This one here is showing depth to anoxia. It's showing that the anoxic zone, when you lose oxygen, is really close to the surface. And as you go into the upland, it becomes much deeper down. You also can see a gradient in salinity. This is a generalized one. It varies depending on what marsh you're looking at. And you can see a gradient in water, right? That shows inundation. And you can also see a gradient in nitrogen. This is just a total measure of nitrogen, so it doesn't tell us that much about it. But that in the upland versus in the mid-marsh, you can see an increase in nitrogen. If we're talking about the different components, nitrate versus ammonium, this might switch around. But that across these marsh gradients, there's a lot of physical processes in place that are controlled in many ways by the biological organisms there. Oh, and this is some of the work I did in these marshes. I'm not going to really talk that much about my research today that I've done in these areas, but one of the things that's marked about these salt marshes is, flip back here for a second, as you go across this gradient, you go across a gradient in habitat types. You have a very sort of rough edge here where organisms that live down here in the marsh plain, organisms that live here in the upland, they can move into this transition zone. They can find food there. They can find sort of rougher habitat. They can find protection from predators, for example. And one of the things that I found in general is that in this ecotone, you actually have higher plant richness. And this is a pattern that's statistically significant. I'm not showing it here. And this consists of uplands that are riparian forests even. It consists of uplands that are sand dunes. It consists of uplands that are coastal scrub. So it's a very strong trend that you see this increase in species in this transition zone, this marine terrestrial transition zone, these salt marshes. I also found a similar pattern when I looked at spiders. These are some of the spiders that I found in the area, that they also respond to that increase in diversity of plants as well as other habitat constraints and show a concentration here in this high salt marsh. So that tells us that these are possibly repositories for speciation events. They're also places where a lot of raptors focus along these gradients to feed. A lot of animals move in and out of this system throughout the day and throughout the month. So they're really important systems, those different zones of the salt marsh. Another ecological role, besides just that harbor diversity that I was talking about, is that they support really high diversity of microbes as well, especially different types of bacteria. Woo! Yeah, exactly. Some fungal species they're looking at a little bit, but they haven't looked at it that much. But these are very biologically active areas. There's lots of change, right? They're gradients. Where you have those physical gradients, you can support a very diverse group of microbial communities. And those gradients change daily, they change monthly, and they change seasonally. So you get this real switch in microbial processes happening there. You also have a lot of that vegetation that's being inundated and rotting, right? It grows really fast and it rots really fast. So that provides a lot of different food sources for many of the invertebrates that live in the soil, on the surface, even up in the plants, like some of my favorites, the spiders. And you have grasshoppers and butterflies and moths, and many, many different types associated with this area. And that all goes to supporting many different species of fish. These numbers here are for San Francisco Bay Area or Pacific Coast in general. So there's over 150 species of fish that are found in and adjacent to salt marshes. Adjacent meaning they might move in as the tides come in and move out. And there's all these invertebrates available for them to feed. As the tide goes up, they move over to that marsh plain, and they start to feed on many of those little amphipods and the little worms and such. And then, of course, that supports many different species of birds and mammals, many more than people typically think of. You look out on the marsh, and you're like, we could just fill it. It's okay, it stinks, not much going on. But there's a lot more going on there than you see when you just first look. Because of that, because people don't appreciate this great diversity that's found in these systems, they're disappearing, and several different species are threatened. We've got rails, and we've got salt marsh harvest mouse. This is on some pickleweed here. That are two of those animals of special concern. Okay, continuing with the critical habitat idea. One of the features of them, here, oops, they're showing you my link where I got this from. You don't need to see that, I'll just point to it. So one of the features of the marsh, like I described, is that you've got the high marsh surface. That tide comes in, it provides fish an opportunity to feed on all those little invertebrates that live in the mud. And so here's a sort of typical salt marsh where you have really sort of convoluted meandering channels, some larger, some smaller. And as you move up that marsh surface, you see a lot of food that's available up here. As those tides move up and rot that, you also have a lot of cyanobacteria. It's a great feeding ground for fish. So they support, especially young fish. They can move up into these grounds, be somewhat protected, and they can also exist in among these channels where they're going to avoid some of the larger predators. As that tide flows out, a lot of that detritus flows out with it. So they're really important sources of productivity to estuaries. That's why those estuaries and those mudflats bordering salt marshes are often some of the most productive systems around. Salt marshes produce a lot of primary productivity through the plants growing, through those cyanobacteria, those blue-green algae growing on the surfaces, the diatoms growing on the surfaces, but also all that detritus, all that rotting vegetation provides a lot of food for those nearshore environments. So that's another reason why they support such a large amount of those commercially valuable fisheries. Okay, that kind of gets to here. So this roughly is what I was just talking about, 71% or so. This is a little bit higher than that earlier number of commercial fish are supported in this nursery. And at least 20 of the 500 species of fish and wildlife in tidal marshes are threatened and endangered. And that has mostly to do with the fact that there's been a lot of habitat destruction, but also these are sediment traps, right? So they're potentially able to hold on to some toxins as well. And as I mentioned before, when I was showing you that picture of that high marsh ecotone, right? A lot of little mammals will live in there. If you go out on a marsh, even around here, you can walk out onto the pickleweed marsh, mid-marsh plain, and you can see these little tracks and these little tunnels. So the little shrews and salt marsh harvest mice and sometimes little voles more the shrew and the mice will move out onto the marsh, feed when the tide's out, and then come back to that high marsh and upland area. But so this is a great place for raptors, in particular birds of prey, to feed. I can't remember her name now, but there's a professor at San Jose State who's done a lot of work on this and has found that just this very narrow zone, sometimes only 1 to 2 meters wide of that high marsh transition zone, supports a majority of the prey for some of these raptors. We've got a harrier right here. Okay. If you have any questions as I'm talking, you're welcome to ask them too. Okay, so here's to my title, right? So you've seen that they're very important in terms of supporting a large diversity of organisms, but they also provide a very, very valuable ecosystem service as kind of kidneys of the coast. And one of that is that they filter non-point pollution. So what do I mean by non-point pollution? I like to think of it, you can't point to the source. So you're not able to point to the source of where that pollution came from. A lot of this non-point pollution is as runoff from automobiles, as agricultural runoff, as industrial runoff. A lot of nitrates. A lot of nitrates come from fossil fuel burning. Different oils flow into these marshes. And what happens when they flow into these marshes, they meet these soil surfaces, they meet this vegetation, they meet these huge microbial communities. And that's how not just the sediments, but those microbial communities within those sediments not only filter out many of these pollutants, but they also transform them to potentially less harmful forms. Along those lines, they purify water. And these different processes you're going to see sort of more dramatic in some marshes, less dramatic in others. On New England, they're really important sources of purifying water and recharging those water tables, the marshes. So as that water percolates through those marshes and goes back into the water table, it's an important source of recharging clean water, and in that process of filtering through that marsh, purifying it. And then they're important sediment traps. So marshes are very dynamic. They can build and they can decrease. And it's not so straightforward, and I'm not going to get into those details, but they're sediment traps because if that water's flowing into the system, it hits that vegetation, it's going to slow down. As it slows down, those sediments filter out. And then they filter out, they build elevation, and then once again, the elevation increases. Just a little tiny note. In Louisiana, the salt marshes there typically accumulate 1 centimeter a year. Really, really low. It should be more than that. After Hurricane Katrina, they accumulated 10 centimeters. This is the salt marshes, and I'm not talking about freshwater marshes. So one of the ideas is that hurricanes are very important sources of sediments as well for these marsh systems. So we talked about freshwater flowing in, but also those marine sort of storm and sources can be important sources of sediment as well. And so they trap sediments, which helps with water clarity. It also helps with trapping some of those sediments that might be toxic. So in this area, for example, a lot of our sediments have asbestos, right? Mercury, naturally occurring. And so that gets trapped in these marshes as it flows down. So kind of purify the water. They're the kidneys of the coast. Another feature of them is that they are very important in terms of flood control and flood prevention. So kind of a working estimate of how they work in this way is that 1 mile of marsh, and this actually writes salt marsh here, because salt marshes behave very, very differently than freshwater marshes, and I'll describe that in just a minute. But 1 mile of marsh can reduce a storm surge by about 1 foot. So where do we see things like, let's say, hurricanes? In the Gulf Coast, right, in the southeast. And that's where those marshes are much more extensive. They've always been very important buffers to these tidal surges, to these storm surges. And so since this has been on our mind, and Carol talked about this in the fall, I wanted to just briefly mention about Hurricane Katrina. And what they found was salt marshes actually lowered that, I should write the tidal storm surge, that surge that came in with the hurricane, by 1.5 meters, which is dramatic. I mean, it's still low, doesn't take away the flooding that happened, but it still is dramatic in many places. And how that's dramatic is that difference can be the difference between, let's say, destroying a levee and not destroying a levee. just that 1.5 meters of difference. And partly why, as I said up there, when 1 mile of marsh is salt marshes have a lot less organic matter. That organic matter that accumulates in the marsh as the detritus dies gets washed out with the tides, right? It gets washed out. It doesn't just accumulate and form those peats. So probably there's a couple of marshes up in Point Reyes that have been sheared off from Southern California, used to be part of rivers, and have moved north. And if you go out on these marshes and you jump around, you feel like you're jumping on a peat bog. It's got a really funny feel. You can feel this echoing. You feel like you're just on this accumulation of peat. And that's because it used to be a freshwater marsh. But as that marsh moved north out in Drake's Bay, now is a salt marsh. It looks like a salt marsh on top, but the soil deep below has got a lot of organic matter. Typically, salt marshes aren't that way. Typically, that you do get some organic matter, but most of it gets washed off. And because they're going to be at the headwaters of rivers and streams and creeks, they're going to be getting a lot of sediment input, a lot of different rock types falling onto them. So they tend to have a lot less organic matter. And that makes them heavier, and that makes them much more resistant to erosion. So salt marshes are very, very resistant to erosion. And one of the things they found, I went to a talk at ESA last summer, and they had that's Ecological Society of America, they had a whole day session on where to go, sort of the ecological impacts of Hurricane Katrina, where to go with it. And there's some, if everyone's ever curious and wants to know more, there's some really interesting models that they've made that you can access on the web. So I can always give you those if you want those. But one of the things that they found was that levees bordered by intact, I could underline that word, intact salt marshes. Oh, this is written wrong. Okay, levees bordered by intact salt marshes did not fail. Levees that were bordered by non-intact salt marshes or freshwater marshes are the ones that failed. So there was this dramatic difference in the response of levees to the tidal surge and to erosion based on whether or not they were next to a salt marsh or a freshwater marsh or a non-functioning marsh. And that's two reasons. One, it lowered that tidal surge, but it also slowed it down. So as it moved across that surface, it slowed it down very effectively because that vegetation is more heavily rooted in that less organic soil. This is a picture here. It's not that clear, unfortunately, but this is an area of a marsh where one of those tidal surges from Katrina moved through, and they kind of call them mud balls sometimes, but it just upped the vegetation and completely rounded around. And this is what you saw in freshwater marshes versus the saltwater marshes. If you looked at the saltwater marshes aerial views, you could still see them. There was some flooding and such, but the vegetation was not as ripped up like this that you saw in the freshwater marshes. So one of the things I said at the beginning was to have salt marshes, what do we need? We need sedimentation. And that's been a real problem. And that's a concern here in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's whenever we're trying to restore marshes, how do you balance tidal surge? I mean, not tidal surge. How do you balance the tides with freshwater inputs that are often seasonal with enough sedimentation? You can open up a salt pond, Cargill salt pond, and say, okay, we're going to return it to a salt marsh. But how are you going to make sure you get enough sedimentation to build up that salt marsh so you have that gradient? Remember one of the early slides I showed you, you have that strong physical gradient in salinity and elevation. So it can be really tricky to restore these. And one of the things that they're working on now for Katrina is, and it's been talked about for years and years and suggested for years and years, is removing this Mississippi River Gulf outlet, because that's this kind of channel that runs through the area, and it has significantly reduced sediment input to those surrounding salt marshes. And so if they remove that, then those sediments would no longer be lost and could start to deposit on the marsh, and they could recover, I can't remember, I read that something like 10 miles of sort of subsided, now that's more like mudflats, would return to salt marsh in a pretty short period of time. So,
So is that a natural outlet?
No, this is a built, yeah. It's a past Army Corps of Engineer. And even the Army Corps of Engineer they really changed the way they manage coasts now, and they're much more sort of ecologically oriented and up on this. And the problem is, it's very tricky with multiple stakeholders trying to get this stuff to happen. But many, many people, many wetland scientists happen to be in Louisiana, right? What is it, 58%? So there's a lot of wetland scientists there who are working on this. and talking about how do we restore the land, how do we get all these ecological processes back, physical processes that are going to support these systems. And one is to remove these completely sort of discordant pieces of the landscape. Another thing, this is an aside, not about salt marshes, but cypress, areas that had cypress trees did remarkably well too. And people have always said, we can't plant cypress, they grow too slowly, you know, it doesn't work. And what they found was even the 10-year-old cypress did really well. And it just has a lot to do with their structure and how they grow, kind of like the salt marsh versus the freshwater marsh. Okay, so I should say I've only highlighted a few features that make these ecologically and economically very, very important systems, but I hope that you get that feeling that these are very diverse systems. They support a huge amount of species from the smallest microscopic microbial level up to, you know, very, very large tule elk you could think of in this way, sort of charismatic megafauna. And they have many, many threats. And as we have come to understand their processes and how they work, there's been much more interest by people like Costanza to give them that economic value, to put a value on those ecological services, those ecosystem services, in order to mitigate and to lessen some of the threats that they're undergoing and to protect them and restore them. So what are some of the threats? Well, as you can imagine, changes in hydrology and sedimentation, just like I was talking about with that Mississippi Canal. Drainage. This has happened in many places. With the West Nile virus, some salt marshes were sprayed with malthione. Is that really going to work or is it not? Are you killing off those predators that can keep those mosquitoes in check? It's pretty complicated. In Belize, they've done a lot of research looking into this in terms of mosquitoes and how they're doing there, and it doesn't seem to be the best solution. But mosquito control, smell nuisance. Remember when I showed you that graph showing how the depth of anoxia, or the fact that in the lower tidal area, those soils lack oxygen. Very close to the surface, there's no oxygen. And so what that means is you get things like sulfur being produced, and you get methanogenesis. You get all these bacteria that do really well in those anoxic conditions, and you can get you dig into a marsh a couple of inches, and it can be very smelly. They just had an example up in Novato, Bahia, where the residents complained that the marsh was smelling too much. And so they made U.S. Fish and Game come out and spray some bacteria that would digest. Yeah, basically. And because, you know, that's horrible. It's like, no, this is just a natural process of what's happening in this marsh system. And so part of that is education, letting people know sign of a healthy marsh or part of the cycles. It's going to go away. When you get the rains, it's going to wash it out and it's going to go away. If you've driven along Highway 1 near Moss Landing, certain times of year you can look out over the marshes and probably want to roll up your windows as you do that. I like the smell just because I've come to working in them for so long. Rotting algae, that's all part of life. But you look and they kind of look kind of yellow, pink, and purple. And that's all of these microbial mats that form on these marshes. So they're very stinky. A lot of them use sulfur in their process of chemosynthesis. But that's all part of the cycle. It's not going to be there that long. You have to consider yourself lucky to see that process because it's like nature's artist palette. But so drainage. There's been a lot of drainage. We've seen that in San Francisco Bay especially. Development. People want to live on the water. And development can be just for recreational uses. Like when I was working on that high marsh ecotone that I did some of my research on looking at spiders, there's this one really nice area out in Bolinas, and it has, it's a nice little path to walk along. And so those salt marsh plants, the grindelia, the gum plant, encroach on it, all the little nesting birds in that area. So every so often they'll come out and they'll mow the path to make sure it's clear for people to enjoy the beautiful marsh. So often development can mean many things. It can be just, I think ignorance sometimes can lead to harming these marshes, because one thing is there's a lack of knowledge about the dynamics of how they work in many ways. Overfishing, that's one of those key factors in terms of threats of many ecosystems. Invasive species are a big deal. You've probably heard about Spartina alterniflora in this area. And also pollution. These are the filters of the coast, but there's only so much that they can handle. So those are other factors as well. I'm going to talk about some of these a little bit more. And this is a picture. Anyone know where this one is? I tried to get local pictures. Joe does. This is China Beach, China Camp. Yeah, and you can drive along this road. There's a campground here. You can hike out along here. It's fun to get out on these hills and take a look. But this looks beautiful, right? Very healthy, extensive salt marsh for San Francisco Bay. But one of the things, if you look at it, remember that earlier picture I showed of all those meandering channels? So this one, the channels are really meandering, but do you notice how it's really straight right here? Any idea why that is? Hydraulic mining. Remember in the Sierras, the gold, all that hydraulic mining, all those excess sediments wash out of the Sierras, and the sediments deposited much quicker than natural. And you can see evidence of that still when you look at marshes around the bay, because you find this really straight channelization where sedimentation was really quick and you lost the meanders. So you can lose out. Those meanders are really important parts of the functioning of a salt marsh, because that's what allows for kind of roughness of edge, which allows for many different fish to have habitat to live in. Okay, another threat is marsh reclamation, and I mentioned this briefly before, but this is when marshes are reclaimed for all sorts of reasons, for farmland, for urban development, for salt ponds, for dumps. These are just to name a few. These are probably the more popular reasons for reclaiming salt marshes, but and because they're as nuisance, right? They stink anyway, so let's just dump into them. That's a good dump. And an example of this locally in terms of marsh reclamation is San Francisco Bay. So there's different estimates you can see of this. San Francisco Estuary Institute does a really good job estimating these. And they found roughly that 190,000 acres of tidal marshes existed historically in San Francisco Bay. And now that's down to 31,000 acres. So a dramatic reduction because of reclamation. Now there's been some work to restore some of these marshes. Chrissy Field's an example. And Joe Can actually worked on that, so if you want to talk more about that, I recommend talking to him. But whether it was returned in many ways as a structural salt marsh, but it lacks a lot of the ecologic structure that's needed to make it function. So it's important aesthetically, it's important for some other reasons, but in terms of its biogeochemistry, functioning as non-point filter, it's not really happening. Okay. It's too small an area. They had some, they basically were not able to make it the size that it needed to be. And hydrology, there's a couple other things happening. I think it's an important tool, though. I think restoration is not always just returning ecological value. It can have a huge effect because it educates people on the value of salt marshes. So I think it's successful in that way. That's very political sounding, isn't it? But, oh, and then I just put this about mudflats because this is going to get me to my next point. 50% of the tidal mudflats remain. That's less than 29,000 acres. On our west coast, our mudflats are very, very important. This is a major stopover in the Pacific Flyway for migratory birds. Very, very critical. And our marshes here on the west coast have been developed. So you may remember way back when I showed you that picture of my ecotone, that high marsh, and then that extensive marsh plain. That's mid-marsh. The low marsh is often very narrow, just a little bit of Spartina foliosa, the local Spartina grass. And so it's often very narrow. So you have these nice extensive mudflats. As the tide goes out, they're exposed, and there's lots of feeding for birds. Well, what's changing that is invasive species. Invasive species are a threat in many different areas, different salt marshes, from plants to animals. It's not just plants. Nutria is an example in Louisiana. That's led to a lot of destruction of these marshes. But invasive species are problematic because they can alter the habitat. They can basically change that structure of the habitat. They also can impact community dynamics. They can outcompete natives, which may be critical for supporting a whole web of other connected species. Another key factor here, and I worked on this a bit, but I'm not going to really talk about it today, is altering key ecosystem processes. They can have very different, for example, dynamics in how they deal with nitrogen. They can have very different dynamics in how they release carbon, which affects those microbes, which affect those different non-point solutions like nitrates and such. And they can carry disease. So locally, well, San Francisco Bay is the most invaded estuary in the world. And a lot of that has to do with because ships would dump their dredge water in the bay, and now they have to do it offshore. So when they exchange dredge water, especially the tankers, right? They fill up their bilges and dump their bilges to keep the weight so they can go across sea. So now they're supposed to dump it offshore, I think above where the shelf break is, so that it's in deep ocean. So that's helping, supposedly. But yeah, it's a very invaded system. And ideally now they're dumping it more offshore, but that still doesn't mean they don't bring in stuff along the way. And some of those passengers were, yeah, exactly, were the mitten and the green crabs. So this was proposed as a fishery, actually, for a while there to try to get rid of them. Then people were worried people would start introducing invasive species to make new fisheries in the bay. So that's one way of trying to deal with this. But these are really big consumers. They act very different than the local crabs. These are up and down the West Coast, not just San Francisco Bay. They can have really large impacts on local infauna. So infauna are those animals growing in, living in the sediments. A lot of the little bivalves, the tiny little bivalves and bigger bivalves, they can affect that dramatically. So an example would be in Humboldt Bay, the presence of the green crabs has led to a 40% drop in manila clams. So that's a dramatic, and this is an underestimate. It's probably a bigger number right now. They also destabilize those tidal channels. Remember how important those tidal channels are? They burrow into the tidal channels differently, and they end up causing breaking up of those tidal channels, which affects fisheries, but it also affects the ability of those marshes to deal with floodwaters and to deal with trapping sediments. They crowd out native species, and of course, they are carriers of disease as well. And you can put parasites there, too. But Spartina alterniflora is a plant locally that's caused a lot of problems. It's from the East Coast originally, and remember those pictures I showed you of those early East Coast marshes, or those extensive East Coast marshes, those New England marshes? That lower, a lot of that abundant vegetation on the bottom was Spartina alterniflora. And here it is pictured here. We have a local Spartina foliosa. It's not quite as big. And there's one key distinguishing feature. If you were to pick it out and look at its base, it's red. Spartina alterniflora is red. Our local Spartina foliosa isn't. But there's a caveat to that. It's hybridized with our local one. So now you can't distinguish the hybrid as well, which is even more vigorous than the invasive. But so as I said before, here's a picture of those extensive mud flats of San Francisco. Very important feeding grounds for many, many different migratory birds as well as local birds. And what happens is when Spartina moves in, it grows rapidly. It comes in and it grows sexually and asexually and can form these huge clones, kind of pictured right here, these clones growing out. This is a little bit closer up. If we look here, look at this. This is all Spartina alterniflora invading this system. And so this would have been mud flat available for birds to feed, and it's no longer available for them. It's very, very hard to get rid of. You can't see this, don't worry, you're not supposed to, but this is just a picture. There's a San Francisco Bay Spartina alterniflora project that has been doing a lot of work on the genetics and the ecology of this invasive species. And I put this up here just to kind of highlight here San Francisco Bay here, but really the South Bay is the area that's been highly impacted by Spartina alterniflora. There are some in the North Bay, but they're actively working on it to try to keep it out. And there's not anything yet up in Drake's Bay or Tamales, although I did hear a report of one in Drake's Bay. So if it moves and expands up, it could be a problem. Big problem in Willapa Bay in Washington as well. So invasive species. In terms of what to do about all of this, a lot of attempts are working on restoring these systems and going to restoration ecology. And I put this up here just to briefly, I wanted to highlight that, this kind of goes to your question, that restoration is not so much just a practice of restoration engineering now, as it is a practice of a science of restoration ecology. And that now, when systems are restored, when these salt marshes are restored, there's these three different factors that are considered simultaneously. And they might consider, one might get one more weight and might get another weight, depending on what the goals are. So Crissy Field might be more in, I say, maybe this area. But so landscape ecology, sort of that context in which that restoration is placed for the desired outcomes is going to affect how we restore these systems. And then the community, and how, what species do we want to put in? What are assemblages? How is that going to affect ecosystem function and those ecosystem services like non-point pollution? And that leads into those ecosystem functions, non-point pollution, sedimentation, erosion control. All of that stuff is what we put into that context of the science of restoration ecology and the practice of it now as well. This is where, in many ways, my research has been based, is on this sort of concept of restoration ecology. Learn about the system so that when we do restore them, we can restore those vital attributes that give them their best functioning properties. And so one question that I asked was, will resistance to invasion increase in more diverse plant communities? So if we're restoring these salt marshes, do we just put in a couple, 3 different species, or do we put in the whole full suite of 8, which is not much in many systems, but in salt marshes, that's high diversity. And because the idea was if you have more species, they're going to be able to compete for those resources better, and they might be able to put up that wall of resistance to invasive species. And so I did a study for a couple years out in Tamales Bay, and I found that in my species plots that had all species, the most species, 6 species, what this chart is showing is this is the growth of my invasive plant. It's right here, rabbit grass. And I'm not going to get into it today, but it has big effects. It totally acts differently with nitrogen. It takes it up much, much quicker. It's potentially really problematic in terms of nitrogen dynamics in the marsh system and the nearby estuary. But what I found was that these are just 1 species plot, 1 species plot, 3 species plot. This control one is all species, but I weeded it, and I removed biomass to sort of simulate making these other plots. So if I have the same amount of species but less biomass, is that going to affect it? And what I found was that clearly the more species you have, the better the resistance to this invasive plant was. So that when we talk about restoring systems, when we restore the structure, how we put those communities together might have a big effect on how well they ultimately, we want a functioning marsh, we want to keep out those potentially invasive species. Another thing is that biodiversity catalyzes biogeochemical processes. This is not my quote. This is from Naeem, who's done a lot of work on this, Shahid Naeem. He's done a lot of work on biodiversity and ecosystem function. And so with that idea, what I want to know is not just, let's say, invasion, but what's another key ecological and economic value of marshes is that they are these important filters. They're important microbial communities. And so I'm going to skip that one too. And, well, I'll go back here. Why not? So what does this mean? I want to give you the background. I've already told you and shown you just briefly that these can harbor increased diversity, these coastal ecotones, these transitions between the marine and the terrestrial environment. They also are these important filters, right? They concentrate the flow and processing of materials. If you want any of these references, I'll come back and you can get them after my talk. I'm going to just move through this quickly. And that, as I mentioned before, they store and remove nutrients and pollutants from upland runoff. So they're very important filters. So if we're going to restore them and make them function, how can we optimize these potentials? So one of the things that I noticed when I was looking at these systems, not related to this question, was that I put nitrogen fertilizer on these light gray grass and not on the dark ones. And over time, I found that all of the marshes had similar nitrogen in them. And that has to do with the fact that different time of year here, that's why the numbers are higher. But basically, when I initially applied nitrogen fertilizer, the ones that had nitrogen fertilizer showed more nitrogen in the soil. But over time, the plants and microbes adapted to that different input similarly and were able to sort of keep that nitrogen addition to buffer it by filtering and processing it. Another thing that I noticed when I was looking at these nitrogen addition studies was that some plants take in more nitrogen than others. So you're not going to convince yourself looking at this in 30 seconds, but basically, if you look at the difference between the dark bars and the gray, you can see this one, it's a big difference. Jalmeh is really good at taking in nitrogen. The stickless is a little bit worse. There's not as much of a difference there. So I found that salt marsh plants differ in their nitrogen uptake. So what that led me to ask then was, will more diverse plant communities, salt marsh communities, have increased nitrogen retention? So I did an experiment out in Point Reyes here in Giacomini Restoration, and I had plots where I had all species, 1 species, different monocultures, and then in between those 2. And if you look at the nitrogen cycle in a big picture, what you find is that this is the box that I've manipulated, right? I'm manipulating those live organisms. And if we look at the whole nitrogen cycle, what we can see is that there's lots of different flows and processes in different pools here. Our main pools are the biomass of live and dead matter, the ammonium pools, and the nitrate pools. These are what are available to plants. Then, of course, the atmospheric dinitrogens out there, too. And so what I was interested in is, as I change this, how do I change the flows in this direction? How do I change the flows in this direction? But most importantly, in many ways, how do I change the flow in this direction? N2O, anyone know what that is? Greenhouse gas, a really important greenhouse gas. And the other thing is, this nitrate can lead to eutrophication in estuaries. We want to filter out that non-point pollution. Remember, nitrate's one of those non-point pollutions. So can marshes do this? And this arrow right here, I'll just tell you, if you've looked at nitrogen cycles before, you've not seen this arrow. This is sort of a new thing, and I don't have the outcome of it yet, so this is just a preview of what you'll see maybe next year. But what's really important here is that potentially this pathway here takes this nitrate, this non-point pollution, and microbes in these systems can convert nitrate to ammonium, which is then taken back up into the organic matter, instead of being released and leached out to that estuary or being released as N2 or N2O. And the way I did this is kind of complicated, and what's really important here is that my goal is, if I change this community, can I have a large impact on this flow? And to get at that's pretty tricky, but why did I think I could change that flow? One, nitrate is the main source of non-point pollution. Two, DNRA, oops, that's a typo there. It quickly converts nitrate to ammonium if that process is in place. They've shown this in wet cloud forests, not in marshes. Nitrogen is primarily taken up as ammonium in the wetlands, so that's a preferred form. And then the other thing is that this process, this microbial process, is affected by carbon availability. Wetland plants differ in the amount of carbon they put into the system. And if you have potentially greater diversity, you might have greater difference in carbon input and a greater potential for these to actually act as those kidneys of the coast. So I use this in tracers experiment. I'm not going to go over it. I just put it up here because I want, if anyone ever wants to talk about it, it's a pretty complicated process. I'm using stable isotopes. You basically add N15, which is only this % of the atmosphere, and it allows you to go back to each one of those pools and follow it through and see where that nitrogen goes. And that's what I don't have the data from yet. But I will show you this, and then I just one more slide, that this highlights, to some degree, this is not the N15 data, but this highlights that in my all species plot, this difference between nitrate and ammonium is much greater than in these, and that's because of potentially this DNRA process. So this highlights that that process is happening in my more species diverse plots. Also, this shows N2O, and what I want you to look at here really are the dark sort of gray bars here, and this is my monocultures over here to my all species plots, and nitrous oxide, that greenhouse gas, is least in my all species plots. So this indicates that there really is something going on in these salt marshes. They're very important kidneys of the coast, but what affects it is how we restore them as well. So bring you back to this last quote that I sort of introduced my talk to on those flyers around, that restoring coastal resources is a priority, and I hope that you can see why after my talk today. So thanks for coming.